Good evening. Everybody wants a piece of the Canadian pie. The First Minister's Conference is underway with the Prime Minister and the 10 Premiers in Vancouver today. I should tell you that there's been no public mention of the countervailing crisis which British Columbia faces and which could cost it between $300 and $500 million a year on the countervail. And there may or may not be unanimity between the forest-producing provinces and the federal government. That's a matter which will have to be dealt with before November the 28th if the British Columbia attitude of trying to deal your way out of it before December the 31st is possible at all. But there were many other interesting things at the First Minister's Conference today. And I think British Columbia's new Premier must be shown first tonight to give you his shopping list from Confederation. Now, earlier in the morning, Mr. Vander gave his shopping list very well like this.
Mr. Prime Minister, your government and its policies can wield enormous influence in the development of British Columbia's economy. Unhappily, some federal policies have proven detrimental to the growth of our economy and have had the effect of significantly draining capital from British Columbia to Ottawa. In addition to its tariff and deficit policies, the federal government has consistently reaped more income from British Columbia than it returns in the form of expenditures, investment, and employment. Examples of British Columbia not getting its fair share are not hard to find. Your government, Mr. Prime Minister, spends billions of dollars annually, approximately $12 billion in fact, over the past 5 years through its procurement process. In 1985-86, of those billions of dollars, British Columbia companies and manufacturers received only 5.3% of the major contracts, though we represent 11.4% of the people in Canada. Let me illustrate my point further. A review of the major federal shipbuilding contracts awarded between 1983 and this year shows they were worth about $4.3 billion. British Columbia's share was only 4%, despite the fact our firms are as competitive as any in Canada or North America. The bottom line is that some overall semblance of equality in procurement should be developed in order for British Columbia to receive and see an additional $300 to $350 million injected into its economy each and every year. Spending by federal enterprises and crown corporations has also been less than equitable. In 1979, and it's the latest data available, British Columbia got only 6.2% of federal enterprise spending. If BC got its fair share, the federal outlay in our province would have been $400 million higher than in 1979. And there are other examples. Federal government employment per capita is lower in British Columbia than all other regions in Canada. And as of December 1985, federal employment in our province was 16% below the Canadian average. If it was increased to that average, the result would be thousands of additional jobs and an increase of more than $300 million annually in wages and salaries in our province. In a province still trying to recover from the harsh impact of the global recession on its resource-based economy, that is a major consideration. All of these examples underline the importance of reversing the federal drain from British Columbia. Mr. Prime Minister, given these facts, and in order to help bring about stable and steady economic growth in our province, the kind that's long-term in nature, British Columbia is seeking an expansion of federal efforts towards British Columbia. In this context, there are a number of ways in which the federal government can enhance and strengthen British Columbia's economy. Such activities include a decision by your government to award the Polar 8 icebreaker contract to the West Coast shipbuilding industry. This would result in an important technological transfer as well as provide 900 much-needed jobs for our West Coast shipbuilding industry. A federal commitment to upgrade the Triumph cyclotron facility in Vancouver. This project offers great promise of major economic and technological spin-off benefits in the future for British Columbia. Legislative changes by the federal government to foster the growth of Vancouver as an international financial center. Such changes, first outlined in the 1985 federal budget, would enable Vancouver to assume greater stature as a prime financial center in the Pacific Rim economy. Federal cooperation in the upgrading and transfer of the Vancouver International Airport to the province, an objective which is integral to our province's plan for Vancouver's future as an international center for trade, finance, and travel. Changes to federal legislation to allow the establishment of special enterprise zones in which industries would not be subject to various tax and other regulatory measures. Federal support for upgrading of the Trans-Canada Highway, as well as continued improvements to rail and airport facilities. Honoring the federal commitment to provide funds for construction of the Vancouver Island natural gas pipeline, so British Columbia can begin to develop alternative industrial opportunities on the island. Mr. Prime Minister, there are many other issues which must be addressed, including the question of our province's representation in the major federal institutions such as the Senate, the Supreme Court, and a host of federal bodies and commissions. The upper house in a federation is intended to represent the various regions of the country in national lawmaking and to give clout to the less populated regions, thus providing a counterbalance to the rep by pop of the lower house. Unfortunately, the Senate of Canada simply does not perform that role. Instead, because of its makeup and the way senators are chosen, it merely confirms the power base of central Canada. Mr. Prime Minister, Senate reform is clearly long overdue. So there are really two sets of issues here: the allocation of a fairer share of federal funding and activity in British Columbia, and the need to work towards increasing our province's presence in the federal institutions that I've mentioned.
And Prime Minister Vander got a good laugh this afternoon when he turned to some subjects dear to his heart. Milk being poured down the drain and not enough corn to feed the extra chickens we've got, like this.
We are having our difficulties with the financial institutions, as I mentioned earlier this morning. If all of the savings that are garnered from British Columbia were put back into British Columbia, the banks could actually be very generous with our business and industry. But very little of it comes back into British Columbia. In fact, those dollars saved by people in British Columbia are invested again in Eastern Canada. But simple things. We have a system which Mr. Minister of Agriculture dictates federally a market-sharing quota. It determines how much of a product might be produced in British Columbia. We have opportunities in British Columbia for a mozzarella cheese export to Japan and other markets. But we in British Columbia are only permitted to manufacture 3% of all the cheese produced in Canada because we are required to protect, by way of federal legislation, the cheese factories in Ontario and Quebec. And again, if this were left to the marketplace, if people here were allowed to compete, if we could use the industrial milk for cheese making as opposed to pouring it down the sewer, we'd all be further ahead as Canadians, and most especially the people of British Columbia and the farmers, perhaps most of all. We have been recently granted an increase in the number of chickens that might be raised in British Columbia. But then recently, too, a duty was imposed on corn from the U.S. in order to protect the corn industry in eastern Canada. Fair enough. We don't argue with that. We don't know what all of the details of it. But most of our farmers are dependent on corn from the U.S. They can't bring it in from Ontario. It's simply prohibitive. It would be too costly.
What?
So here we are granted, additional chicken production, but now we can't afford to feed them anymore. So
I'll guarantee that that was the first time in all the history of Dominion-provincial relations and First Ministers' conferences that cheese, mozzarella cheese for export, as it turns out, was part of the agenda. Next, we're going to take you through a little bit from Mr. Mulroney responding to Paulie, and some of the tougher talk about free trade, freer trade with the United States after the break. Premier Paulie of Manitoba raised at the conference today the subject he raised here last night about the unfairness of transferring the CF-18 contract from Bristol Aerospace to Canadair in Montreal. Not on the basis of disparity was his complaint. It was not just. Prime Minister Mulroney, here's part of his answer to Paulie at the meeting today.
I acknowledge that from time to time in a federal state there are going to be disappointments. They are not brought about as a result of malice. These decisions are made in the national interest. From time to time there will be satisfaction on one side, and I understand displeasure on the other. But I think at the end of the day, when Manitobans, and you, sir, as Premier, look at what has happened in Manitoba, and you look at these numbers of 6.9% unemployment, equal to Ontario, which is the most powerful growth area now in Canada. I think that's a great tribute to what Canada has been able to do in cooperation with Manitoba. So fairness does apply. Although I'll acknowledge that from time to time there are instances which give rise to criticism. And what we're trying to do is correct it. I feel badly when I listen to Premier Hatfield, and I know in terms of equalization, here is a Premier coming up, Premier Vander, with an unemployment rate of 12.1%, and we're going to take money out of his pocket in British Columbia to give it to Manitoba. In terms of equalization, to be fair, to be even fairer, I'm talking conceptually. I'm not talking in terms of dollar for dollar. So it's the fairness doctrine that Canada operates on that I know you're not challenging, sir. And I thank you for your comments, but I just wanted to make the notion that, to make the point that from time to time there will be elements that will strike people as being unfair, but the country and the notion of confederation has, I think, served us all well.
You
Yes,
made
sir.
some unfair comparisons the last few moments, and I will discuss those later on.
I'll be happy to give you the time, sir.
You appear not to be aware of the relationship of Manitoba to average national wealth in Canada. It's well under average national wealth.
I
That
understand.
we don't have the resources of many other provinces, a small economic base. And I'll be delighted to debate that and to discuss some of the points that you've raised later on during this conference.
I'll be happy to give you the time, sir. And I thank you for your observations.
But the thread that was running through the meeting today as the various premiers gave out their shopping lists and their concerns was free trade, or freer trade with the United States. And for instance, we're told that 2 million jobs in the United States depend on the trade that comes in from Canada. But Grant Devine of Saskatchewan was quite blunt and direct about what the nation faces if it's not united.
The number one threat to this country's health today is international protectionism, the unfair trade tactics of people around the world, and the collapse of prices and pricing mechanisms. I would say at a minimum, Mr. Prime Minister, at least 25% of all the jobs in Canada are now threatened by international protectionism, the unfair trading tactics, and the collapse of not only prices but price mechanisms. And I'm not saying that to frighten anyone. I'm saying it because I absolutely believe it to be true, and I believe the more we study the international question, the more we realize that that's the case. I thought about our discussions last night, and I thought, if only the Canadian public could have heard us talk around that table last night, and to listen to the premiers describe what was happening to their communities, and their families, and their farmers, and their fishermen, and their steel producers, and all the people that were being hit and hurt by international protectionism, you would see union coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that we join together and take it on. Because every premier there identified the problem. And it seems to me what we have to do at this table today is be as frank and as candid and as open with the Canadian public as we were with each other last night. Because we heard about the irritants and we heard about the problems. But we also recognize collectively, and I believe as David Peterson did today, the Premier of Ontario, where the problem is coming from and what we have to do to address it. Well, in my view, it's extremely important that we address the problem as a nation, not just as Saskatchewan or as British Columbia or as PEI, but as a nation. What I saw last night was the classic domino effect, as premier after premier described what was going on in this nation. The United States and other countries first started to pick on raw resources. It started with fish, and it started with farmers, and it started with commodities that we produce across Canada. And then it's moved on to the manufactured goods. It started in the Atlantic provinces with fish.
Saltfish.
With salt fish.
Nobody listened.
And it moved to farmers. And it went to vegetables, and it went to potatoes, and it went to wheat, and it went to pork, and it moved on to beef. And then potash and uranium and oil and softwood and steel and automobiles and manufactured goods and electrical projects and tens of thousands of jobs all of a sudden were at stake as a result of what was been happening, the domino effect hitting Canadians. And maybe no one was listening when it was hitting saltfish or when it begun to hit agriculture products. But they're listening now, because every premier and every politician in this country is starting to recognize what's going on in the international world. They may not have recognized it 3 years ago or 2 years ago, but they do today. And not only in the raw commodities and the natural resources, but in every manufactured good that we ever thought about exporting. And if we don't address it directly, it's going to address us, and it is. I want to say also, Mr. Prime Minister, that we can't handle it alone. Saskatchewan cannot take on the U.S. Farm Bill by itself. And I don't believe British Columbia can take on the softwood lumber issue by itself, nor, given the strength of Ontario, that can take on the U.S. government on an auto pact or anything else by itself, or any province in the Maritimes. We have to collectively pick our targets and work together to make sure that we get the job done. My point is simply this. It's the largest problem this country has faced in decades. It's massive, it touches everyone, it's complex, it's standing in the way of what we want to be in the future, and I believe it's time for everybody, it's time now for everybody in this room and Canadians across this country from one coast to the other to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, and realize what we have to do and deal with it. Not deal with it alone, but deal with it together.
And what Grant Devine, Premier of Saskatchewan, was telling us was that he wished the private dinner of the Premiers and the Prime Minister last night had been open to the public to get the feeling of the extent of concern about U.S. protectionism and world trade. It was David Peterson of Ontario who said later that Canada can't march to the music of 10 different bands. Unity, unity. A little bit from David Peterson, Ontario.
The recent U.S. actions concerning softwood lumber stand to jeopardize one of Canada's leading economic sectors and hurt some of the provinces extremely badly, particularly British Columbia. What is more, it could set a very dangerous precedent that could be applied against other parts of the lumber industry and other natural resource sectors. Using the softwood lumber precedent today, the Americans could attack us on potash tomorrow, fish the next day, uranium the day after that, followed by oil and gas, wheat, hydroelectricity, and other resource sectors. Let us never forget that we have a totally different system of land ownership and resource management than the United States. And what's at stake in the softwood lumber issue is nothing less than whether Canadian resource policies will be dictated by U.S. interests or decided by the Canadian people. In light of the fact that U.S. protectionist pressure has grown since the free trade talks got underway, I believe that we must together recognize it's an immediate problem that calls for an immediate response above and beyond the current negotiations. The recent U.S. congressional elections leave Canada with a limited window of opportunity to combat this aggravated new wave of protectionism. We must act now to point out to Americans the negative consequences of this protectionism, to themselves, to their best trading partners, and indeed to the entire world. It is my belief that they have the potential to turn back the clock as it was in the 30s. You recall the introduction of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that could send the world into some very dire economic circumstances. And we've got to persuade them that they must avoid a mistake that has the potential of having historic proportions if they continue on in a way that they might. If we share that sense of urgency about the problem, I am hopeful that over the next 2 days we can together jointly work out a plan to counter the U.S. protectionism.
It really is quite a fearsome visage painted by Peterson and by Grant Devine. The question of the loss of a large number of jobs. Mr. Peterson made it perfectly clear, too, that he's very nervous indeed about tampering with the Auto Pact. Now, I've got a guy on a murder later on. There are no easy answers. But I think we'll see if you'd like to be a premier. And let's go to a free-for-all on what we've learned so far about the First Minister's Conference in Vancouver, if you have any views, because to me it looks very odd at times. Everybody's there asking for their share of the pie. Nobody objects to redistribution on the grounds of need, but everybody says that it's being unfairly done, both in the Atlantic provinces and in the Western provinces, and that the healthy, wealthy central province of Ontario probably gets more, I think Mr. Barassa, or somebody said this afternoon, than it's entitled to on the formula shares. So let's have a free-for-all on how you'd run this ungovernable country after the break. I was hoping to get a certain premier live from down there for this evening's program, but of course they're tied up in very important business, and I believe they've gone into a private session right now. And I've got my author, to whom I must give 1 pound of flesh, 1 segment, but I'm going to do 1 segment of calls on how you'd like to run the country. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack.
Yeah.
I've been looking at the ministers' conference this morning and this afternoon, and to me, the 2 premiers that are coming over the best are Pauline and Devine.
Both prairie boys.
Yeah. They seem to both be coming over the best as far as I'm concerned.
How does Mulroney look to you? Look.
He looks like he's taking it in, but I don't know whether it's going in one ear and out the other.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack.
Yeah.
I'm listening to Mr. Devine, and I really can't believe what I'm hearing. He's talking about free trade. He's preaching about free trade.
Right.
Saskatchewan, we're a manufacturer in British Columbia, and we cannot quote into Saskatchewan. They don't tender other than to manufacturers inside their own provincial.
You mean Saskatchewan will not take bids from British Columbia manufacturers?
That's correct. This is in telecommunications cable.
That's the name of the firm, is it?
No, I won't mention the name of our firm, but the product is telecommunications cable, both copper cable and fiber optic cable. And the same really applies to Ontario, where we have an artificial trade barrier in that Bell Canada only purchases from Zalm Telecom, and they again won't take tenders from within Canada, and that goes for manufacturers in British Columbia, and also looking at it from the outside of Canada and the concerns of the United States to free trade. It's a major
handicap.
tariff
Good.
non-tariff tariff.
Thank you very much. Illuminating call. Go ahead, please.
Oh, Mr. Webster, I'd just like to say how disappointed I am at sitting there. I thought Mr. Vander had some very logical and factual points to make, but it's just so depressing. I mean, I can just see Brian sitting there saying, oh, God, I can't wait till this is over. I can get back east and not worry until the next one. I mean, does he really take those figures back there? Doesn't he already know them? I mean, and does this minister meeting really accomplish anything? I mean, does he take it seriously? Does he have to?
Well, of course, he's into an incredible deficit, and the feds will come up with figures, I predict, as they have done before, saying that British Columbia gets its fair share, the hundreds of millions they put into natural gas and all the rest of it. I think the arguments about figures are really kind of specious, although I think British Columbia has got a good case to make in some more share of the lolly compared to what they've had in other parts of the country. But I don't know that it means much. I think the important thing is for them to tackle issues. Every premier today, a number of them made a mention of the new patent drug law, which might have some influence on...
Do you think they'll ever get together like when one premier suggested today that BC can't fight the states on the tariff, and Saskatchewan can alone fight the agriculture?
Oh, I think...
So get behind it and unify in some way, or with the feds.
I think
they seem so dilly-dally over this free trade thing. Why don't they just shut the door on that and say, look, let's address some single issues first?
Well, I think they're making an effort. I wouldn't like to knock their efforts. It's an awesome responsibility. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, yes, Jack. With this free trade thing, you know, I think in the first place that the free trade deals with the United States should never have been embarked upon. They're far too good for Canadians. They'll turn us every way they want to. They started off with the lumber, you know, the shakes and shingles. And they carry on with the wheat deal in Europe, where they cut down the prices, and it forced Canada also to compete at lower prices. And I think, you know, really we should forget the whole thing, just call the whole thing off, and let's go back to where we were.
Fair enough. Well, I'm reliably informed that while that's my own particular reaction, I'd say, okay, they want to tariff us, they want to put a duty on. But apparently, the broad picture does tell you that unless we're one of the few countries in the world which does not have a big market of its own. We're not in the EEC. We're America's biggest customer. They've got a new wave of protectionism, and some people would tell you that it's absolutely imperative that we negotiate a free trade deal with the United States, even if it does mean dislocation in some of our industries for goodness knows how long. I'm not an expert. I'm willing to listen to it. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Jack, my only comment is if we as Canadians want to deal with the problems like the CF-18 contract and a lot of other these other regional issues, we should give the Senate some power. If we had a governing Senate that had 5 men from each province, that could balance the population by representation by population problem.
Well, first of all, you got to reform the Senate. And
right. Too many fat cats getting too much money. If the CF-18 went into a Senate, a real Senate with some power, it would have never made it through.
You may well be right, sir. Go ahead, please.
Yes, it's my opinion that Canada will never, ever pull together until we break back the power of central Canada.
But how would that help us to pull together if we break their back?
Because right now we have no reason to support the rest of Canada. We're not going to get any share of the pie. Eastern Canada gets more than their share of all the contracts. They dominate it culturally. The CBC operates out of Toronto. If we had a Senate that could represent us by area, by region, then we would all feel like saying, hey, this is Canada, we can do something.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. These calls demonstrate, you know, a feeling of alienation, I suppose. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Back on the topic of free trade with the Americans, before they go slapping all these tariffs on our exports, why don't they take into account the dollars we're exporting to the United States from foreign-owned companies?
You mean the payment of all the profits back into the United States?
That's right.
I suppose that's considered in our trade balance with the United States. I don't know, though.
Yeah, I thought it was all on goods they were basing their figures on.
Well, apparently that does help to balance our books. It's a good thought, though. Thank you, sir. Go ahead from Summerland.
Yeah, Jack.
Yeah.
I was interested when they're talking about this protectionism.
Protectionism.
Yeah. That it seems like we're going to have to end up as one big family. And perhaps the McDonald report, which advocated a basic wage with subsidization throughout the entire country, would be the ultimate end result. That's for the wage earner.
Yeah, I think you're mixing apples and oranges, but if we go on the way we're going on now, we may have to cut our coat according to our cloth.
Well, that's right.
Which would considerably reduce our social safety nets.
But don't you think there'll have to be, if they're going to emphasize what each area is good at, as far as exports concerned, there'll have to be subsidization.
You may well be right. I'll be back with the author of No Easy Answer, and I'll still leave a segment for the end after the break. Change of pace, and it's not always easy in this job. But I remember a couple of years ago interviewing a woman from Halifax who gave an emotional pitch that a young Canadian had been unjustly convicted of manslaughter, was it?
Aggravated manslaughter.
Aggravated manslaughter. A young Canadian called Bruce Curtis. Now this fellow David Hayes has come out with a book called No Easy Answer, the trial and conviction of Bruce Curtis. I just got the feeling that sometimes people jump into campaigns without knowing the full facts. Do you agree with what I was told a couple of years ago, that he was unjustly convicted or unjustly sentenced after a very poor trial?
He did get a poor trial, and he was unjustly sentenced. Those two things are true. The picture that Canadians had been given of Bruce Curtis was not exactly accurate, I don't think. It reflected the mother and father's
We'll come to the detail, and one has every sympathy, of course, because he had never been in trouble before. He was a nice young guy, clean guy, away with a friend in his friend's house, right?
Right.
And he was 18 at the time. And what did he get in the way of a sentence?
20 years.
Well, what makes us think it could be unjust? He got 20 years for aggravated assault as one of two people.
Yes.
What did his friend get?
His friend got 20 years as well for murder, which was the minimum sentence for that crime. Curtis got the maximum for his lesser crime.
The other guy who did the actual, admitted the killing,
yes,
he got murdered. Where did this all happen?
In Lock Arbor, New Jersey, which is a shore town, part of the Jersey Shore resort area.
Now, give me the case as to why we should have perhaps helped to pay this boy's legal fees, which are up to $100,000, trying to get out of there. Tell me the story.
Well, Curtis went down to visit this American friend. There was indeed a lot of domestic squabbling in this house. The stepfather was a tyrannical old guy, not as bad as we've been led to believe he was. However, I think his stepson, Scott Franz, Curtis's American schoolmate, felt that it was time for him to assert himself, and he did so by blowing his father's brains out that morning. Curtis, however, was downstairs, didn't see the shooting, but heard the shots, was frightened, grabbed a loaded rifle that was there, and as he tried to run out of the house, he came around a sharp corner, and as he jumped back, running into the mother, the gun discharged accidentally, he says. In fact, later at the trial, it was shown that that gun was a faulty gun. It may have all happened this way. The problem is the kids didn't phone the police. They didn't simply panic and run away. They cleaned up, wiped down bloody walls, put bloody bedding into garbage bags, and loaded the mother and stepfather into a van, dumping them in a ravine in Pennsylvania, took off for Texas, and were arrested 5 days later.
The young Canadian had gone to stay with his school friend, his mother, that's the school friend's mother, and stepfather.
Yes.
His school friend decided to kill his stepfather.
Clearly.
Blew his nut off.
Right.
And after the kerfuffle, the young Canadian, who's been hiding in fear, but has a rifle with him, right?
Right.
Rushes up from somewhere, bumps into his friend's mother,
and the gun
kills her by accident.
Discharged, so he says, and indeed the facts do support that part of it.
Now, what about the trial? Because I thought in the United States, if there was anything less than a fair trial, you could generally have the thing knocked over.
Well, not in this case. The state had nothing like the kind of evidence they needed against Curtis. The gun that Curtis was using, which the prosecutor was attempting to demonstrate was perfectly safe, in fact, misfired accidentally in the courtroom. There was a number of other inconsistencies during Curtis's trial. And I think generally the feeling down there was they had a weird, psychopathic, brainy Canadian. They had read his diary, which was one of the first pieces of evidence that the investigators found. And the diary was very strange. It was filled with weird, morbid ramblings, and the investigators thought, this is a weird one we've got here.
But you've seen the records of the trial. Was it an unfair trial?
Yes, it was. It was. There was a number of elements.
Why can't this boy be brought back to serve his sentence or whatever in Canada? I know we do that on some occasions.
That is possible, and in fact, they're working toward that now. Just a matter of 2 weeks ago, New Jersey ratified a treaty that would allow Curtis to come up and serve his sentence. His family, however, think that's the second best, because he's still going to have to serve the full sentence.
Oh, once he got up here, they'd let him out, wouldn't they?
Well, he'd still have to serve a few more years. And in fact, in New Jersey, people are actively fighting Curtis coming up because they think just that's going to happen.
Bruce Curtis, the boy, was a very bright boy, as you say, but a little bit morbid in his diary and whatnot.
Certainly was.
And it does seem like he got a raw deal, right?
I would say it seems like a raw deal for what we know happened there. It doesn't really matter if Curtis was a bit of a strange egg. The point is that the trial was not fair, there were inconsistencies, and if we allow the justice system to work this way for Curtis, it may work this way for one of us someday.
Now, you've researched both the boys and you've researched all the court trials. Can we now say that he was a naive innocent?
Well, he was certainly naive. He was an odd fellow. He was a bit of an arrogant kid, intellectually superior. He had a bit of a contempt for authority. So the picture of him as simply being a mother's lovely son is not accurate in my view. However, I don't think that materially changes the fact that he didn't get a fair trial. That's what's important to me.
So now he's in jail. Where is he in jail? What kind of jail?
In New Jersey, a penitentiary which is filled with racial tension and definitely not a nice place.
And his people visit him there?
Well, when they can, which is a problem. It's an expensive trip.
Sorry for them. $100,000 is spent up to now.
That's right. It's very, very sad from the point of view of the mother and father.
They appealed the case and didn't win it, I presume.
Appealed it twice.
And lost it on both occasions. Well, David Hayes, I wish you well. It's a nice, jolly book for Christmas. No easy answers. And the subject, Bruce Curtis, has received a lot of publicity over these years. Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, Jack.
I'll go back to my free-for-all after the break. Well, we're going back to a free-for-all anyway, to see what happens. Still no sign of any settlement in the IWA strike, which is almost at the moment a bigger disaster than some of our trade policies, trade wars, trade troubles. Go ahead, please.
Hi there, Jack. I've never voted Socrat in my life, but I'd like to say that Mr. Vander is doing a pretty good job. The issue of the chickens and the cheese, and I think what we need to do as British Columbians is support him in negotiating a free trade agreement with Ottawa for us.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Behind that, of course, is Bill Vander attitude on marketing boards and whatnot. And while it sounds great to wipe out marketing boards, if we ever wiped out marketing boards in this country, much of our local agriculture would collapse, I suspect. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jack. Nice to talk to you again. If I was running this country, I would run it more as a business and get rid of a lot of the politics and the bull crap that's involved.
That's what we've all got to do. Just run it as a business and there's no problem. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to just say I think the Western provinces have been getting screwed by Central Canada ever since day one. And every few years, some Western group speaks out about the West separating. I really think the West should think seriously about this alternative, considering the present East rules West attitudes of Ontario and Quebec.
Let me ask how old you are.
23.
23. And you seriously think that it should be North and South? You'd join up with the states, of course, wouldn't you?
I think, yeah, geographically and all that, that's the way this continent should have been divided in the beginning.
Well, of course, I'm a new Canadian, and I came to the country in one piece. I was in one piece, too, and I want to see it stay in one piece regardless. I'm sure we can work out our difficulties.
I would like to see it stay together, too, but given the way things are, I mean, look at those numbers Vander was throwing around, and...
Well, the feds will come back with responses, although there was a fair amount of justification in some of what he said. How did you vote in the last election?
I voted Conservative and Socrat.
Goodbye. Thanks for your call. I don't mind asking people how they voted. Some people get very shifty and snotty about it and say that's my private business. Shouldn't be ashamed to tell people how you voted. Go ahead from Smithers, BC.
Well, Mr. Webster, just like to comment on the fact that I really think that Ottawa doesn't treat us fairly. I know this has been said and said, but it seems to me that there has to be another formula for dividing up the pie, because there is a lot of economic prosperity, it seems to me, in the east, and where I am up here in Smithers, there is not that same amount of job potential. I'm currently working, but I'll be laid off shortly, and I'll be working again after a couple of months. But for a lot of other people up here my age, it's hard to find work.
Well, it's not so easy.
It's not that I'm saying that the government should provide jobs. I don't believe in that. But if the East is getting, say, 30% and they're only entitled to 25%, why are they getting the extra 5? I'm just using this as a hypothetical number.
Well, of course, you're arguing from numbers. It's really a question of you raise a certain amount of provincial and federal tax in this country, and both the Liberal and the Conservative government are dedicated to the equalisation payments to make extra payments to the have-not provinces collected from the have provinces. Now, British Columbia is still a have province. Manitoba's a have-not province, which is one of their particular gripes at the moment, but they only have 6.8% unemployment, as Mulroney pointed out today, whereas we in British Columbia have an official, 12 to 13% unemployment, and probably in real fact, hard fact, it's more than that. I don't know how you can do it. The answer, of course, is the development of resource industries and the building of small business, although it gives me a shudder when somebody said today, I think it was Peterson, that in the next 50 years, the next so many years, half the jobs will come from small businesses. And small businesses don't give the wages and fringe benefits which we in the West in British Columbia have been used to from what was once our powerful trade unions. I don't think there's any easy answer. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jack. I just wanted to make a comment on Mr. Mulroney's general attitude so far at these talks. He seems to sidestep every issue that's brought up to him. He's tripping over himself, dripping sugar. When is he going to start answering? He's got a lot to answer to and a lot to answer for, and I want to hear something. I don't want to hear, "Thank you, sir, I appreciate your comments." I want to hear answers.
Well, he's not likely to give blunt answers in the open forum. The real negotiating, of course, is done behind closed doors.
Why didn't he answer when challenged by Mr. Devine? I liked what Mr. Devine said, and I liked the stance that he took. And
You mean he could have responded a la Devine, that we must all be united and whatnot and whatnot to fight protectionism in the United States and around the world? Yeah, he could have done that.
If challenged, I mean, he's on national television, and he still just sidesteps the issues. I mean, Fred Astaire has nothing on him.
I'll tell him that.
Okay.
Bye. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Jack, I'd just like to say that I agree with the earlier callers, some of them in regard to establishing a Senate or something with equal power representation from every province or region, because as long as the voting system as we have it today remains intact, the West is never going to get a fair shake. Like the CF-18 contract, that would have been political suicide for Mulroney to give it to Manitoba, and he knew it.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, of course, Mr. Vander wants the 900 jobs from the polar icebreaker if the federal government decides to go ahead with the polar icebreaker, and he wants to put here regardless, not going to Montreal, because he says we haven't had our share of the shipbuilding contracts over the past X number of years.
Yeah, but what do you really think our chances are getting that?
As a matter of fact, because of the political pressure, I would say the chances of getting most of it are quite good. I understand the entire Tory caucus in BC is ready to explode in a little blue light.
Well, it's about time, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm not saying it's the right overall policy for the country for the future to merely dish out contracts to encourage industry. That's not a very healthy state of affairs. Oh, nobody there. Nobody there. Can I take somebody else? Anybody? Go ahead, please. Hello.
Yeah, hello. Is that me?
That's you.
Yeah, I'm calling about the unequal treatment between the East and the West, needless to say, like everyone else. And I think we could all agree that definitely there are things to be done, Senate reform, et cetera, but the thing is, it behooves the Eastern political machine to maintain things the way they are, and I can't see how all the rhetoric in the world is going to change that unless the West gets together in some sort of a coalition and says either do it or else.
Well, you're taking the
I'm not talking about Western. I suppose that I'm leading in the direction of Western separatism, but I'm a born Canadian. I'm 40. I've lived in the East. I've lived here, and I think I'm pretty aware of what goes on in the world. And the Eastern political machine, as I call it, is
all powerful.
Well, it's all powerful. It's perpetuating itself. It's giving itself indexed pensions that are that the rest of us wouldn't even dream of. And they're not going to give that away voluntarily. We can talk and tell them the facts of life, and they can agree, and it's not going to change unless we stand up and say,
stop, yes.
Reform it, or we'll run our own ports on the West Coast. And it's hard, but I think you and I both know that nobody gives anything away.
What you're really talking about is checks and balances in the parliamentary system. That's what you're talking about. A Prime Minister with a massive majority under our parliamentary system really can do what the devil he likes if the majority supports him. And people seem to be reaching out for a different kind of Senate as a kind of balance wheel, as a check on the actions of the House of Commons. I don't know if we'd ever get round to that. Have a time for a very quick one from Kamloops.
Jack, I'm just kind of surprised at some of the people that reacted from the fact that the premiers of the Western provinces in particular, and the Eastern provinces for that matter, are coming after Mulroney for their share of the pie.
They've got to, and I've got to go. And I'll be back after the break.
From James Clavell, the author of Shogun, comes the first major motion picture filmed in China, Taipan.
I do not kneel to any man.
One Taipan is the Taipan.
Prime Minister Mulroney and all the premiers have just finished a meeting in private, apparently on the softwood lumber issue. There was talk that they were going to make a statement if they came to an agreement on tactics, but they didn't come to an agreement, it seems, because there was no statement. Tomorrow, Barbara McDougall and James Clavell on Webster at 5 p.m. precisely. Stay tuned for the news hour.